Bonjour, merci, merci beaucoup. Premièrement, j'aimerais remercier la Commission canadienne de lait, Bob et Serge, et bien sûr Madame Cousineau et Madame Paul, et toute l'équipe du Canadian Dairy Commission pour l'invitation et deuxièmement le travail impeccable qu'ils ont fait pour monter cette conférence, présentation. Je devrais dire au commencement, je ne vais pas parler trop en français, j'ai peur que mon accent c'est fatigant pour le plus grand des personnes, mais j'accepterai sans doute des questions en français. J'ai fait de mon mieux de répondre en français aussi. It's interesting that I was following along with Minister Bibeau and with Raymond. I think Minister Bibeau said the administration is going to be, quote, tough and fair. And Raymond just finished saying the U.S. doesn't give anybody any presents. My own take on it that I was going to lead with is basically we can expect more of the same, but inflicted on us in a much more polite fashion. The thing to understand is Biden is not a gift to Canada. We have to be, as Raymond said, vigilant in all aspects because we will have disputes and they will continue, but there are some aspects of the Biden administration which will make it a lot easier to resolve those disputes. Not only will we, as Canadians, get a better welcome in the United States from the U.S. Administration, and that permeates all the way down through, for example, simple delegations going down to Washington. That's a very interesting thing. What also we have to keep in mind is the place that we're coming from. Just a quick review of the Trumpian trade policies. The administration withdrew from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The administration crippled the WTO, and the WTO is a very important agency from a Canadian perspective because it gives us the ability to rely on a rules-based system. He renegotiated NAFTA, and the NAFTA is the new agreement has some fairly strong labor protections and dispute resolution protections. Canada is already seeing the dispute resolution possibility in respect of dairy. Mexico is looking at the labor dispute resolution issues in respect of its labor policies. The Trump administration started a trade war with China, which most officials would tell you has had the opposite effect. Instead of making life for China more difficult, it has made life for most American industries more difficult. It has also enhanced the position of China in the Pacific region. So the China issue is something that's going to be very top of mind for the Biden administration. And then the legacy of Trumpian politics would be an almost deliberate move away from the traditional allies. And we see in Mr. Biden's speeches that he wants to revitalize those relationships with allies. Now, we have a new USTR, that's the United States Trade Rep. It's a cabinet level position, and the USTR drives the administration's policies in any number of different ways. The person who's been nominated, and we hear that she will, in all likelihood, be confirmed, she has a very good reputation, is Catherine Tai. Catherine Tai is a first-generation American born of Chinese and Chinese parents, has also lived in Taiwan. She speaks Mandarin fluently, and she's also one of the finest trade lawyers in Washington at the moment. So she had previous experience at USTR, and that's deep experience in trade agreements, both negotiating them and in dispute. She has huge experience dealing with China, and reportedly is very tough on China. So Biden has decided not to touch any of the tariffs at the moment, probably because he's waiting for Madame Tai to be confirmed and to begin to take the reins in terms of driving U.S. trade policy. But she is certainly somebody to watch, and she is cast in the mold of Biden. One of the most important things she said in a recent speech is that trade policy in the U.S. is going to be worker-centered. Now, what does that mean? It's not simply another way of saying America first. It's saying America first, but American consumers, American workers, farmers, etc. We're going to look after those interests in all of our trade dealings, whereas previous administrations could be said to have been looking after building opportunities for Canadian companies and protecting certain Canadian companies probably less effectively than it could have been doing. So that's the sort of the background of the new administration that's coming in, and in terms of their priorities, it's pretty much America first, American workers first, and we'll see how that plays out. Now, the one thing to sort of think about, one of the things to think about in this new administration and when Madame Tai gets her position confirmed by the Senate, is that she will have an enormous amount of things on her plate. I went through the Trumpian policies. All of those policies will influence what's happening in Washington. And then the question is, well, how much attention will she pay to Canada? And the answer is probably very little, unless there's a screaming loud problem, because she has as many screaming loud problems as she can deal with at the moment. We know that there's a possibility of a dispute resolution mechanism coming into play in respect of Canada's allocation of dairy quota. The U.S. is objecting to the level of quota given to processors and further processors, and would like to see more given to distributors. So we'll see where that goes. Interestingly, when you read the CUSMA, C-U-S-M-A, or U.S. MCA, there are fairly straightforward provisions on quota allocation, on the limitations of discretion in terms of quota allocation. And we saw very little of that in previous agreements. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And it was good to see that the minister, at least publicly, is convinced that Canada will win in any dispute resolution process. What also is important, and I should say at the beginning, I'm reluctant to talk deeply about dairy issues to a body of people that likely know so much more about the intricacies of Canadian dairy policy today. So I'm going to keep it fairly simple, but I recognize that there's a huge amount of knowledge in this virtual room, and don't hesitate to correct me if you think I'm misstating anything. But In addition to the US issue with dairy quota allocation, the issues facing the dairy industry are not simply the new agreements that were passed in the past, because the pain from those new agreements are going to be spread out over the years. So it's not simply we had a one-time shock of an increase in quota, thank goodness, because that would have been disastrous, but we have continuing pain in terms of quota increases year after year after year after year. So it's going to happen each year. The quota gets enlarged, and some of the growth rates, for example, I think, and I can be corrected, under CETA, the cheese quota grows from 2,667 metric tons to 16,000 metric tons in year 6 of the agreement. So it's a sort of a continuing pressure on the Canadian dairy market as a result, a direct result of the CETA, the TPP, and now CUSMA. In terms of agriculture, there's you may be aware, there's now a complaint against Canadian blueberries going into the U.S. market. We're lumped in with Chile, who is a massive producer, but these kinds of disagreements will always come up, and some will never be resolved. I'm thinking of softwood lumber, which has paid for the retirement of a couple of hundred trade lawyers over the years. It seems to be absolutely impossible to resolve. So we shouldn't expect a new Biden administration that everything is going to be great for Canada. We are going to be whacked, for want of a better word, from time to time. Keystone XL is an example of it. Biden considered he had absolutely no choice in the matter, and better get it done now than wait and try to talk to Canada, etc. It was a campaign promise. We all knew it was coming. The Buy America provisions, there's two ways to look at that. One is it's an absolutely very serious problem for Canada and will become worse as time goes on. But understand that what the recent executive orders on Buy America, they weren't legislation. What was happening in the executive orders is they were tightening up on the grant of waivers and on various other loopholes that allowed for the use of, let's say, Canadian steel in certain projects. So there was a waiver process, and there were a lot of waivers granted, and people began to become expert at seeking those waivers. So the executive orders addresses that, but the executive orders also throws down a very clear flag that Biden will be looking for increased legislation applying Buy America to the extent that the administration can do it, because there are some limits in certain trade agreements as to what can be done. But look for more Buy America measures, but certainly look for much tighter enforcement by the various purchasing agencies on the grant of waivers. And that will take away a lot of opportunity in what is promising to be massive infrastructure projects. If you look at, I said earlier that Madam Tai is going to, the new USTR is going to have a lot on her plate. Probably the thing that keeps her awake at night is the dispute with China. The Trump administration famously signed a phase 1 agreement with China, which seemed to settle the waters a little bit, except for the fact that China didn't live up to its limited commitments under the phase 1 agreement. So things are not looking good for a phase 2 or a phase 3, but the U.S. obviously needs to try to reestablish itself as the global leader it used to be, rather than allowing space for China to come in. Where the new negotiations will go is it's hard to see, but Madame Tsai is not a pushover from all I hear in negotiations with China. She also, I should mention, knows as much about the nitty-gritty details of trade as she does about the politics of trade. She most recently served as the counsel to the senior counsel to the Ways and Means Committee, which means that she understands politics. She was instrumental in getting bipartisan support for the Kuzma deal, talking to both Democrats and Republicans and explaining why they should come together to support that deal, and is credited with generating that bipartisan support. So she knows politics and she knows trade. But going back to China, one of the things that countries like Canada has to look at is the opportunities that the trade war with China presents for Canadian exporters. Brazil immediately took the lion's share of the place selling soy to China. When China decided to put pressure on the United States and stop buying its soy, Brazil stepped up. There are always opportunities. I hate to say it, there are often opportunities in somebody else's pain, but in a self-generated war with China, between China and the US, we, Canada, ought to be on the lookout for opportunities to export to China to replace what the US was exporting, and in many cases we can do that with agricultural products, and we should be looking to see where those opportunities are. Of course, I recognize that that Canada-China relations are also difficult at the moment, and what we might get today may well turn into a complete blockage tomorrow when China decides to change its policies. That's why I said earlier we need a rules-based system in order to be able to resolve those disputes. In terms of the U.S. policy towards Europe, that's interesting, because there was talk a while back of a U.S.-EU trade agreement. There were negotiations during the Trump administration, and now, given the amount of work that's already going to be required for the trade administration, for the USTR, the word on the street is negotiating new trade agreements, for example, with the EU and with the UK. Those are going to be put on the back burner because there isn't enough bandwidth to deal with everything that needs to be dealt with. With the US, we still have an ongoing dispute, subsidies to Boeing, subsidies to Airbus, and retaliatory tariffs. What happens with retaliatory tariffs is that the countries imposing the tariffs will choose agricultural products and consumer products much more readily than any other kinds of products. Why? Because what usually happens is that there is either a ready available source for the agricultural product. So a duty on an agricultural product from the United States means that, well, European buyers can simply go and buy the same product from Canada or from Mexico or from Brazil. There are many other options. So imposing the tariffs hurts only the US, doesn't hurt consumers in the country of import. And if you look at the retaliatory tariffs imposed by the European Union on US goods, you'll see that many of them are either unprocessed agricultural products or processed products. I recall working with a client that was looking at Canadian retaliatory tariffs on orange juice. And we had a very difficult time of trying to convince the Canadian government that it shouldn't put a tariff on orange juice. But the answer always was, well, that's US orange juice. They can buy orange juice from Brazil, which is true. So again, when there's a dispute, EU and US, there may well be opportunities for Canadian exporters to step into the fray. While we're talking about the CETA, also, yes, we spent a lot of time thinking about the exports from the EU into Canada, but from what I hear from government officials, Canadian businesses are still not taking full advantage of what is on offer in the United States in terms of a market that they can exploit. I think I said before that Canada, being a mid-power country, which we are, we need to have multilateral institutions in order to allow us to exercise some power within a rules-based system. Under Trump, the WTO was decimated. It was frozen. There is no appellate body able to conduct appeals because the U.S. refuses to nominate or to support nomination of judges. There's nobody in charge because the U.S. has decided not to nominate or support a particular person for the post. WTO is a very useful multilateral forum for Canada. It saved us in softwood lumber. It saved us in a number of different disputes. So we need to support the U.S. We need to encourage the U.S. to support a revitalized World Trade Organization. Lastly, I would just point to the fact that given the number of priorities that the U.S. has on its plate in terms of trade, it's beginning to look unlikely that it will have agreements with the UK or with the European Union anytime soon. It also looks unlikely that it will rejoin the CPTPP anytime soon. And in fact, the fast-track authority that had been given to the administration to negotiate trade agreements and then put it to a simple vote of accept the agreement or don't accept the agreement, that authority has ended. So any agreement, or will end shortly, any agreement that the U.S. negotiates will have to go through Congress and be subject to amendments, etc. So all of a sudden, the U.S., without fast-track authority, has become an unreliable negotiating partner. What does that mean for Canada? Well, it means that Canada can continue to take advantage of the benefits of the trade agreements that we do have, the TPP, the EU agreement, and the UK agreement, without trying to sell their products. I've seen numerous examples now where Canadian products are displacing US products in certain markets, and for example, the TPP. Why? Because the US products are now 8% more expensive, or whatever the tariff is. The last one I looked at was maple syrup, which now has a definite, obviously a market cachet because it's the Quebec maple syrup is the best in the world. But in the Japanese market, where they like maple syrup, we're now 8% cheaper than the US because there's a duty on the US. We're cheaper because we're in TPP. Our products are cheaper. So Canadians will continue, I think, to look to exploit those new agreements, which has the additional benefit of lowering our dependence on north-south trade. It can help. I'd be happy to take any questions, and there could be questions for Raymond. I think I see him waiting there, eager to answer any questions. We're both happy to answer, and the questions can be in French or in English. Thank you.